the beach.
Uh-oh, they're recording.
Oh, no.
Yeah, I just was going to announce that we do put these up on Zoom. I'll wait for a few minutes.
So I'll clean it up.
Yeah, yeah, behave yourself. So one of the advantages of recording this is people can, come, they can watch it asynchronously, and I'll mention that when we get more people in here. Oh my gosh, I see a student coming in I haven't seen for a million years. Former student, I should say. I see one person is going to eat lunch and doesn't want to be seen eating lunch, and that's fine.
The other trick that I use sometimes when I'm eating lunch during Zooms is they have the filters that like show a mask over your face, the funny filters they have. With that one, it actually doesn't show your mouth as you're eating. And so like your hands keep going up to your mouth, but nobody can see it. So.
Oh, that's funny.
Yeah. I would only do that with certain groups, but.
Sometimes I close I have a little gerontology thing on my computer I can close.
Yeah.
So
yeah, sometimes I just put like my hand up and then take a bite.
Oh my gosh, this is really a great group that's coming in here. I can't believe it. Here comes David Haynes, one of my favorite community members. Hey, Leslie. Okay.
Hey, how are you?
How are we doing? Oh, there's still more people coming in. Okay. This is great. Okay, well, it's a couple minutes after 2 after 12. Let me welcome you. I'm Rebecca Adams. If you don't know that, I'm the coordinator of growth. And my second today is Chantel Caro, my colleague in gerontology, and also another member of the Growth Faculty Executive Committee that sets these up. We are recording this session. The reason is that thanks to Francis Bottenberg, who's also on the executive committee, we now have a growth YouTube channel. If you search for UNCG growth channel, it'll come up, and not all of the previous Zoom sessions are posted there because a couple of times we had technical issues, but most of them are. And so we'll upload Dayna's presentation eventually. So if you want to share it with people who couldn't come, that's a way to do that. Let's see. Oh, there's even more people coming in. This is terrific. I want to say welcome to everybody. We've been trying to improve the growth distribution list. And for the first time, I was able to send out a message to all of our gerontology alums, starting with the programs we had back in 1984 to the present. I finally have a complete list of graduates, and we're still missing email addresses for about, I'd say about 60 people. So I'd love it if I'm going to post on the UNCG Gerontology Facebook page. I'm going to post those names. And if any of you are in contact with those people, please have them email me. We can return to that later. I think we will have time at the end to go around and introduce ourselves and perhaps make offers for collaboration. That's one of the main purposes of this network, is to connect faculty to each other, to connect faculty to community, to find placements for our students, to find ways we can collaborate with our community partners. So think about whether you have an offer you want to make that someone won't be able to refuse. So I think that the entering is slowing down here. So let me go ahead and introduce Dayna Touron. She is a gerontologist, a cognitive aging specialist, and has just had a book come out. And so this is a very well-timed presentation for her. She is a former member of the Growth Faculty Executive Advisory Committee and has been active in growth since I restarted it back in the day under, I might say, former Dean Celia Hooper's leadership. And she's here too for the first time. I'm delighted to see so many of our community partners, alums I haven't seen in ages. Let's get started. Dayna, take it away. I assume you'll take questions at the end.
Absolutely. I'll take questions at the end. I'll take questions during. If somebody puts a question in the chat or raises their hand and I don't see you, somebody feel free to chime in, because I'm glad to do this, kind of informally and just, talk about this line of research and the book, as Rebecca was saying. And thank you so much, Rebecca, both for the work that you do to, really, have, encourage discussions and dialogue and sharing about aging issues on campus. And also specifically for inviting me to come and talk today. This is, a talk that I haven't given before because it was motivated by Rebecca asking me to talk specifically about the themes of the book I just had come out. And so let's see, I'm sharing screen, right? Can everybody see it?
Yes, and I would ask that everyone mute unless they have a question. I'm doing it myself right now. Thank you. And thank you, Dayna, for coming. I'm really excited about this presentation.
Well, yeah, thank you so much. And so, like Rebecca said, I had a book come out. This is my pandemic baby, this book. And it is entitled Multiple Pathways of Cognitive Aging, and it looks at motivational and contextual issues and influences on cognitive aging. And it's really been a journey for me, starting to do research in the area of these more kind of volitional, often, aspects of cognition. I was trained as a cognitive psychologist and a quantitative psychologist who did basically develop mathematical models of learning and how they differed for young and older adults, and became interested in questions that were of a more metacognitive kind of volitional nature. And over the course of my career, my work has moved more and more into that direction. I should also say it was fun to write this book, and it's fun to talk about it because as a full-time 12-month associate dean, research is very much a hobby, which both makes it a bit more stressful to do it, but also helps kind of clarify the joy that there is in it, because, I really am, I love those meetings, and I love working with my grad students and postdoc and all of those folks. So the motivation for this book came out of a seminar series in Warsaw in April of 2019. So this was my last, I think, big travel I did before the pandemic. And so I've got some pictures. So a university with a strong cognitive aging presence in Warsaw brought some of us from the US together to do this seminar series from some foundation grant funds and talk about research on this theme of motivational and contextual issues. And I have to say, I don't know how many of you have been to Warsaw, but Warsaw is beautiful. The food is ridiculous. I was not anticipating, the just the amount and just the flavor and all the food there. So we did do research, we did the seminars, but as you can see, the picture on the far right here, like every day there were just tons of trays of food. Like the Polish like to feed you, and they like to feed you well. So it was a beautiful trip, wonderful memories. And the book ended up coming about because we decided to write a proposal where the different participants in the seminar series wrote chapters about different aspects of motivation and volition and just environmental context and how those affect the trajectory of cognitive aging. So the three major themes of the book are motivational issues, and so how people's engagement in the task and sort of desire to perform the task and perform the task well affects performance in cognitive tasks as people get older. And I think that's very important. A theme for me in my research has always been looking at situations where our stereotypes, or even data, even findings on cognitive change with age, don't tell the whole story, where we sort of exaggerate our beliefs and conceptions of the extent to which cognitive changes occur because of the way we're looking at these phenomena. And that was a motivation for me that came out of early in graduate school, when I'm really digging into the cognitive aging literature and studying it. I found it so puzzling because everything was really characterized by a focus on decline. And I knew a lot of people who were in their late 60s, 70s, 80s, and I knew a lot of college students at that age. And for my money, the college students were functioning less well. And so I just found it so puzzling. Like, why is everything characterized by decline in this science when that's not what I see when I look at older people that I knew. So motivational issues, contextual issues, we usually study people in a laboratory setting. And so I think it's important to study people outside those settings in order to get a better picture or fuller picture of what people can do. And we also in the book talk about compensatory mechanisms, so things that people can do, again, from a motivational volitional point, but particularly due to intentionally perform better on tasks. And also interventions. I'll talk a bit about different training and engagement studies and the efficacy of those. Again, if at any point you have any questions, just let me know. I'm going to start with kind of broader themes and other people's work. And because this is my talk, I'm going to spend, in the latter part of the talk, I'm going to talk about my work in this area. I was on 4 chapters in the book about different areas of work that I'm doing, as well as editing pretty much the whole darn thing. So I do a lot of work in this area, and this is, I think, a nice opportunity to get to share that with you guys. So when I say cognitive aging, you guys know this already, but I'm talking about mental abilities like your memory. I think when I say cognitive aging, people most often assume it's work on memory. That's in part because we have some strong stereotypes about memory aging. And expectations. And there's also a lot of the science on cognitive aging does look at memory, but there's also work on attentional focus. I'll talk about some of that today. Work on processing speed, which is actually very important integral to cognitive aging and performance on a wide variety of more complex tasks. Creativity, flexibility, all of these abilities are a part of cognition. And of course, that little pie chart in the middle is not actually the way things are divided up in the brain, but just shows these are all things going on in our heads. And in terms of broad characterizations, we see a lot of variability in how things change. And one of the sort of classic distinctions that's often made are distinctions between changes in fluid intellectual abilities and crystallized intellectual abilities. And again, you guys probably already know about this. Fluid intellectual abilities, which you can kind of think about as being governed by sort of your biological hardware, tend to show declines. These are z-scores, so their standard deviation declines from one standard deviation above the mean for these individuals across adulthood, this is 20 to the 80s, and down to -1, which is one standard deviation below. And so you see these declines in a couple of standard deviations from the 20s to the 80s. Then there are abilities like crystallized abilities, which are more sort of knowledge-based abilities, which tend to show much more stability, even increases. And again, you guys have all probably, you're probably all familiar with these general ideas. What I also want to talk about, though, are differences in these types of patterns across individuals. So these are growth curve models. Every one of these little lines, and it's you don't need to tease them out in detail. These are all for fluid intellectual abilities, and each of these lines is a person. And so each of these lines represents about 7 to 8 years from initial test to post-test for these folks. And so these are all response times. So it being higher means that you're getting slower. But these are on a number of different types of fluid intellectual processing tasks. And what I want to point out here is that everybody does not look the same. And this is a really important thing when we study aging, because there are huge aggregation biases. When you average over older adults, sometimes you end up with something that doesn't really characterize anybody. And I'm a big fan of individual level plotting and always knowing my data intimately in terms of individual differences. And so you see some people, yeah, certainly that are getting slower over these 7 to 8 year spans. This is looking at folks from about 60 to 90. And again, in these sort of 8 year spans, but you also see folks who are getting faster. And this isn't just, so there's some like up here where it's probably kind of a regression to the mean. This person was very slow to begin with. So of course they got faster. It's probably some kind of testing artifact. But we also see for a lot of people that there's either stability or improvement over this range of time. It's not one size fits all. There are huge differences between individuals. Some of this is going to be due to, factors like, biological factors, genetics, lifestyle factors or background factors that people can't really change in adulthood necessarily, but many of them actually are due to lifestyle factors that are controllable or factors that are contextual or motivational that are that also are controllable. And so this is an aggregation, basically characterizing those different patterns. So this, again, for these different fluid intellectual abilities, doesn't really matter what they are for my point here. We see how many folks are showing stability, and that's the gray bars here. How many folks are showing decline, that's the black bars, and what percentage of folks are showing improvement. And so despite the fact that we characterize fluid intellectual abilities as showing substantial declines, and that is true on average, it's really important. We miss a lot if we don't think about and look at a broader scope and look at the extent to which some people are showing stability or improvement in these abilities over time.
Dayna, could you, I assume those are different measures of.
They are. Each of the things on the y-axis.
Give us some idea what those.
So this SRT is just simple response time. This is complex span. I mean, these are all just very kind of quick, and you can tell that just from the nature of the response times here. These are things you do really fast. So these are all different kinds of decisional tasks. And that's critical because these are the tasks that we believe decline the most and the earliest. So the fact that on these simple speeded cognitive tasks, you're seeing this variability is really important. So another point that I want to make, and this is from, I think this is data from the health and retirement study. So this is looking at basically percentages of individuals in, what we might characterize as older adulthood. That can be a moving window depending on the study or the area of study. But here from 65 to the last group being 85 and older, of individuals with, so the dark part of the bars, and this is for women and men, the percentage of individuals that are showing moderate or severe functional impairments in memory versus mild or no functional impairments. And I like to show these data because it relates to my own kind of initial perspective of, gosh, most of the older folks I know are doing really well. Why do we have these stereotypes, and why do the data look like they do? And despite these, these stereotypes of loss, and most critically, the idea that loss and decline is inevitable, it's really not at all. I mean, even in this health and retirement study, which is a huge epidemiological study, looking at 85 and older, even only 30% of those folks are showing severe memory impairment. So aging should be characterized by stability and health and vitality, despite our sort of stereotypes and social constructions of age. And I think it's, again, I'm preaching to the choir here. You guys all know this, but it's something that I have found very motivating in the work that I do. And when I don't get to teach undergrads anymore other than honor students in my lab, but when I talk to undergrads, I think that's the most important thing I want them to get over the course of the semester, that these stereotypes of loss and characterization of aging as a time of loss is just inaccurate, as well as limiting from a societal as well as personal level. So that's a soapbox I like getting on. But another point I want to point out today in regard to individual differences, so how different people differ in terms of aging, is this idea of there being different paths of age. And so again, the title of this book was Multiple Pathways of Cognitive Aging, and this figure depicts some different sort of possible pathways that people can experience. And so this looks at cognition, low to high. This is a theoretical model. So high is better. Over chronological adulthood, 20 to 100 here. Really critical here for each of these paths, which represents a different pathway of aging, is when do they cross the functional threshold according to their chronological age. So we might have a more negative profile or more decline oriented profile, where a person, this is in yellow, profile D, where at about 70 this person is going past this functional threshold where they probably need assistance. On the other hand, there are individuals like this idealized pathway A, where they see increases in cognitive performance up to the 60s, and then decline where they really aren't passing this functional threshold until they're centenarians. Of course, there are other possibilities. There's a more moderate threshold here in B, which is the blue, and C is an interesting one because it highlights the possibility of ameliorating the pathway you're on. So this green pathway was kind of on a more negative trajectory, but then made some kind of adjustment, whether to some kind of factor like diet or exercise or something like that, had some sort of medical treatment, got off a medication that was causing problems for them, that adjusted their pathway of aging. And so C is an interesting pathway because I think it shows the possible flexibility of these different pathways. And so, like I was saying before, the determinants of where you are, some of this obviously is going to be beyond people's control. factors that are genetic, biologically based factors that aren't subject to adaptation, but some of them are under our control. And so I'm going to move on now to talking about some of the, I picked out some of the really interesting findings and areas of research in this study of motivational and contextual issues on cognitive aging. And in recent years, one of the most influential new theoretical perspectives is the perspective of selective engagement by Tom Hess and colleagues. And Tom was he's actually just retired professor at NC State. And they have a really good cognitive aging program that also does human factors stuff, which I am friends with a number of folks over there, and they do just fabulous work. And so this is very much, sounds like engaging selectively in work, kind of choosing whether or not to perform cognitive tasks for all sorts of reasons. And this counters these impressions we sometimes have that older adults as participants in laboratory studies are always, or really just doing things out in their everyday lives, are always going to be more motivated. And I think sometimes we conflate task motivation with kind of pleasantness when they come in. I know that my undergraduate research techs always comment on how they didn't really understand how surly other undergrads were until they contrasted them with the older adults that come into the lab, who are just lovely to talk to and to work with and are happy to see them. And, it's just this really positive experience every time they have a session with older adults. But then they have younger adults and they don't want to be there, and they make that really clear. So they think they're motivated to be in the study. They're motivated to come to the lab and chat, but that doesn't necessarily mean they're engaging with the task more heavily. And there's been some work trying to tease those things apart. And so this is kind of a complex figure. So let me walk you through it. Again, this is there is empirical data that backs this up, but I really want to talk about it kind of broad strokes today. So basically, this model says that the extent to which people engage in a task is going to depend on how beneficial the task is for them, what they see as the benefits for, as well as how costly it is, how challenging, how hard is it. And that's going to affect whether people engage or whether people don't engage in the task. And so when a task is beneficial in terms of the cost benefit ratio, people are more likely to engage in it. And I'll ask you to pay particular attention to these areas that I have highlighted in yellow, because those demonstrate the older adult scenario, which is that as people get older, both their threshold, so this is this upper line, they have a higher threshold to be willing to engage. The cost benefit ratio needs to be higher. And so these two lines correspond to this axis over here. And engagement depends basically on this threshold and on the task benefits. And so for older adults, they don't cross their engagement threshold until the task is pretty beneficial. Whereas for younger people, they have a lower engagement threshold in terms of benefits, and they're going to cross that much earlier. And so the point that I make in the second bullet point is basically that older adults can be less motivated to engage in challenging tasks unless the benefits are high. And so they're not going to put a lot of their cognitive resources into it because they because they're just not as necessarily as motivated. They don't see it as beneficial to them to do so. And some of that could just be due to, I think, kind of learning over time to kind of choose your battles. This is, I'm going to work on this. I'm not going to, it's not like they're not doing the task. They're not non-compliant, but they're not doing it like a video game where they're trying to beat the task in the way that younger people might do. And this is important to me and kind of relates to sort of the theme of my motivation for doing work, because this lesser engagement can look like decline. They're not performing optimally, they're not performing as well as they could perform because they're less engaged in performing the task. And again, this is contrary to what we've often had as expectations, and there's a growing amount of empirical support. I would say, though, that I think this is a motivational influence, but I think it can be contextual as well. I think it probably depends on the task. And so what the shapes of these functions look like probably vary depending on not just how challenging the task is, but how self-relevant it is, how much people think that they might learn from it for the future, rather than just in the moment. Another area of research that looks at motivational influences is work by Alan Castell at UCLA, who's done a lot of work looking more at selective focus. So older adults' ability to selectively focus on information that is either fits into schemas, mental schemas they already have, fits into existing knowledge they have, or is self-relevant. And this is data from a study that Alan did with a grad student. And on the top, these data are younger adults, the bottom is older adults, and we have proportion recalled from 0 to 1, so 100% on the y-axis. And so you can see it's like from not getting anything to being perfect on the task. Higher is better. And these are a couple of different tasks. That part doesn't really matter. It's just kind of a replication. And these, the two different colors of bars are whether the information is personally important or unimportant. And so you can see for both of these memory tasks, remembering names, remembering occupations, younger adults, they do a little bit worse when the information's not relevant to them, but there's a very small difference in performance for personally important and unimportant information. It's a different picture when we look down here at the older adults. If we compare for the older adults, the personally important versus unimportant information, you see that there's a huge difference when the information's not important to them. So they're performing at a much lower level. It's not that they can't do it. It's that they are selectively focusing their resources on the task when it's relevant and important to them. And again, if all we were looking at, and in cognitive psychology, we are often, for good reason, in terms of experimental control, looking at kind of arbitrary, learning of arbitrary information, that's unimportant, right? I mean, you know, especially if it's something like nonsense syllables or something like that at the extreme. And so we might often be seeing performance that's well below older adults' abilities because of the types of materials that we're choosing to study. And a number of different areas of inquiry have started to have conditions that also use more sort of ecological aging relevant information in order to try to gain some traction on this question and understand really the true extent of declines or changes that have occurred. This is some more research by Alan Castell looking at schematic support. I've done some research with this paradigm as well, and it's really interesting materials. These are more ecological materials because what you're learning is the association. You have to remember a pairing of a grocery object with a certain price. And in the contrasting conditions that Alan uses in this work, he compares a market priced condition. When he did this work, he was at the University of Toronto, and both the products that he had and the prices were kind of crazy because I was doing some work in this area and he had sent me all the stimuli and I was like, that doesn't look like anything I've seen before, and those prices are crazy. So it was very funny. And he didn't tell me that, like it didn't have the dollar sign on it, which is funny. So their market price, so like, you know, a box of butter for $2.99, or they were overpriced. So here's a can of soup, $16.49. And so, I mean, this isn't information they already know. They don't necessarily know the price of that object. That's not what they're what's affecting things, but it's just even having a schema, even it making sense to them. And the overpriced condition, it just doesn't make sense. They don't really have a schema. They feel very arbitrary. And what we see, again, this is recall here from 0 to 60% in the market priced in the overpriced condition. This time the white bars are young, the black bars are old. In the market price condition, you actually see that the older adults are doing not appreciably, not statistically better, but numerically a little bit better than the young people, certainly not worse. But in the overpriced condition, again, stuff they can't wrap their head around, it doesn't make sense, it doesn't fit a schema they have, older adults are doing worse on these tasks. And so again, this tells us that they're approaching the task in a different way when it makes sense to them than when it doesn't make sense to them. And I don't think there's anything magic about this. It's really about the types of memory strategies that people are bringing to bear on learning this information. All right. And again, I could talk about that grocery price study like all day. It's really, really cool research. I'll move on now to talk about some work that Sarah Barber at Brandeis has been doing on a phenomenon called the positivity effect. And the positivity effect is it's kind of a loose and broad term for situations in which you tend to see better performance as well as preference by older folks towards positive information relative to neutral and negative information. Actually, Brittany Cassidy in our psychology department is a social cognitive psychologist who does some really neat work on the positivity effect and does some neuroimaging work in that area as well. And so again, the idea here is that there's better memory for and more attention to positive than negative stimuli. In this one, this looks at the positivity of recall. And so it's basically the difference score between how they do for positive versus negative information. So if it's above this 0 line, it means that they were showing a positivity bias. If it's below, it shows that they're showing a negativity bias. And so here we see these are the older adult bars. They're showing a positivity bias. Younger folks aren't showing the positivity bias. Now, the two different bars here, I chose this figure to put in here because it gives some information about what people believe is going on with the positivity effect. And it's often explained in terms of socio-emotional selectivity, Laura Carstenson's theory of how people adjust their social environments as well as their emotion regulation and selective focus as they get older. And let me show you, I'll come back to this to show the difference between expansive and limited future in just a second, but just to show a model of socio-emotional selectivity theory. This goes from infancy to old age. And really, I think the most important part is to look at here in older adulthood. So this is the salience of social motives. What's important to you? And emotion regulation becomes important. Like people don't want to feel crappy. People want to feel good. It becomes more important. Information seeking and your self-concept become less important. And that's probably because you've already learned a lot. You have some confidence in that, and your self-concept is more stable at that point. And so the idea is here that older individuals become better at emotion regulation, in large part from a motivational perspective. It's important to them. It becomes more important. And another, I think, important line of work from socio-emotional selectivity theory is changes in social networks. So whereas young people like to have a vast social network of people that are all very different, and they don't necessarily have emotional intimacy or closeness with, not a lot in common with, maybe even a preference for folks they don't have a lot in common with. This is because information seeking is really important when you're a young adult and adolescent. As you become older, you tend to have a smaller, more tight-knit group of close others that are important to you, right? Because your goal is emotion regulation, these are the people that make you feel good rather than information seeking and knowledge building. And so also, Carstensen believes that part of the explanation for socio-emotional selectivity theory is your time horizons. And the idea is that when you are young, you think you are immortal and you have an expansive, you have a limitless amount of time to do different things and to feel good and all of those things. Whereas as a middle-aged or older person, you become more aware of the limited time that you have left, not necessarily in a sort of depressing negative way, but sort of in a realistic, you know, I want to spend my time optimally. And so when they do different manipulations that prime for people, either an expansive or limited future, you see that when you make younger people feel even more immortal, feel like they have a limitless amount of time, they become even more willing to kind of engage in negative stuff, focus on negative stuff. But if you make older adults feel even more limited, make them all the more sort of aware of having limited time, they will show even greater positivity. So these sort of experimental manipulations are often seen as evidence for this explanation of the positivity effect. So I'm going to move on now to talking about different both questions I've been interested in, work that's going on in my lab. And I'm going to start by talking about some work on a concept called subjective age. And it's heavily influenced by context, I believe. And so it's one of the things I have been thinking about a lot and trying to understand in terms of the research that I do. And so this is a plot of a scatter plot of individuals showing the relationship between your felt age here on the X or on the Y-axis and your chronological age. So basically when, and this is the 0 line, which is I feel exactly the age I am. I think most of us, if we say, how old do you feel? Like most of us understand that as a concept. People wouldn't say, well, I'm this age, so I must feel that age. What do you mean? People get it. Participants get it in the lab too. When you ask younger people how old they feel, they tend to feel older than they are. That doesn't last long into adulthood. It actually, there's some work showing that it kind of corresponds to what we see as aggregate patterns of decline in fluid intellectual abilities. And so individual differences, though, there's scatter here, right? Looking at a line rather than a scatter plot wouldn't give us the whole picture. But in general, people in young adulthood feel older than they are. As you get older, you feel younger relative to your chronological age, if that makes sense. And I mean, I think most folks here, I venture, are above the sort of 20-year-old group. And so understand that, like it, and I'm interested in contextual influences on this. So there are days when I feel much older than my chronological age. If I don't sleep well, if I'm overburdened, overstressed. And then there are days when I'm feeling healthy and vital, when I might feel much. So I think it's important to think about this as a flexible concept. Subjective age is important as a construct because it's related to a lot of things that are important. Subjective age isn't just kind of, as a mental exercise, an interesting thing, but it's predictive of all sorts of outcomes that are critically important. And I think these things are probably bidirectional. At least there's evidence for that. This is data from a meta-analysis looking at a bunch of different studies. These are basically the effect sizes. So how big of an effect? So anything, so I covered the 0 line with this yellow line. So you could see anything past the yellow line. So again, these are Cohen's D effect sizes, shows that there is a positive relationship between that ability and subjective age. And these top studies are all cognitive abilities. And so there's a bit of wiggle room in there, but a lot of these are showing that people who feel younger do better cognitively. These are all looking at well-being. There are strong links. There's a lot of research looking at links between subjective age and depression. And so people who feel younger are less likely to be depressed. And also overall well-being, life satisfaction and well-being broadly construed. And again, positive relationships. Now I could say that I struggle often with the fact that I think this concept of feeling older as doing this line of inquiry kind of burdens the idea of age as negative, right? So it's like, I feel old today. When people say that, I think they're saying, I feel slow, or I feel, and so I find it like kind of problematic in that way. At the same time, I think it's a really important thing to understand. And we and others have done some work trying to figure out what do people mean when they say that? And what sorts of beliefs as well as experiences are brought to bear on those judgments. So these are all more sort of psychological outcomes, but maybe even more critically, there are also biological, physical outcomes, health-related outcomes. Again, you don't really need to look at these in detail. These are the same kind of effect size curves. So these are a bunch of different studies looking at biomarkers and different aspects of physical health and showing positive relationships between subjective age and health. These are studies looking at longevity. And so these are survival analysis curves. The ones on bottom are for the top 25% of subjective age, and the darker survival curves are the bottom 25% of subjective age. And so basically it's showing that people who feel younger live longer. Again, I think this is bidirectional. I think that they're tuned into something that's happening in their body that's probably related to longevity, but people do lagged analysis also showing that feeling younger predicts later having better health outcomes greater than it should, greater than the opposite relationship, basically. So it does seem that both feeling young does something to make you fare better in terms of all these outcomes, as well as those types of outcome variables being part of your construction of your subjective age. Does that make sense? Okay. So I became interested in subjective age, and well, in doing research on subjective age, in part because I brought on my postdoc, Matt Hughes, who this is some research from a Psych science paper he did with Lisa Garaci, and they looked at how you can change subjective age. I think it had a snazzy title, something like aging 5 years in 5 minutes or something like that. Because what they did was they did a pre-assessment of subjective age, and then they gave them a memory test and these older adults showed big increases, like 5-year increases. And they didn't ask them for numbers because people would give you the same thing. Instead, they used these slider scales so that aren't marked. And so people will respond without those sorts of heuristics. I'm going to say the same thing as I said before. And so there are 4 studies here. The first study, so this is change in subjective age. Higher means that they changed more, they felt older. And so this looked at from baseline pre-test to post-test, saw an increase after a memory test. So they became interested, does this happen to everybody or is it specific to older adults? They found it for older adults. Younger adults did not show any change in subjective age when they took a memory test. Then they thought, is it taking any sort of assessment or any kind of passage of time? They compared doing a memory test with doing a vocabulary test. As you saw, older people in these older adult groups, these are folks that are between about 60 and 75. They get better at vocab, not worse, in that relative to young people. So there's no reason for them to feel challenged. It's not going to be a challenging task. Most of my participants find the vocab tests really fun. I guess this is why people do things like Wordle too. Like people find these types of games enjoyable. So these older participants felt older after a memory test, after a vocabulary test, and in terms of so study 4 was really cool. They told them they were going to take a memory test, but then they didn't even do one. So it wasn't the act of doing the memory test. It was just thinking about how they do in memory. So it's more of a kind of a stereotype threat. It's like bringing up these stereotypes and knowing you're going to have to perform a task for which a group you belong to is stereotyped to perform poorly. And so again, they felt older after doing that. So this is really cool work. And when I had the opportunity to bring Matt in as a postdoc, I was like, yes, let's come here, let's study subjective age. And this looks really busy too, but this is a model that Matt and I just published on contextual influences on subjective age. So again, Matt has done these experimental studies showing that context, the context of taking a memory test, can change your subjective age. But we're interested in it more broadly and in everyday life. And so I'll first bring your attention to this, the sort of white boxes in this top line. The bottom boxes just kind of explain them. And so we believe that both your kind of lifespan context, like your understanding of the world, the developmental roles you inhabit, the general experiences you've had and built up in your life, as well as your immediate context, like the taking of a memory test, physical experiences, time of day, these kind of momentary immediate contexts affect your subjective age. That this is the idea that sometimes you feel older, sometimes you feel younger, and that can fluctuate during the day. And we believe that immediate context affects subjective age through reflective thoughts that you have. So you're thinking about, oh, my memory is not what it used to be, or, these are the stereotypes people have, whether it's consciously or you're sort of unconsciously having these sort of thoughts and feelings primed. The way that you're monitoring your performance, the awareness that you might have of your own age-related changes, and all of those things that kind of bubble up in the context that you're in, and in the context of being asked to report how old you feel. And so that's one part of this model, but we also believe that we can take a contextual approach to understanding the relationship between subjective age and health and wellness. And so this is the idea that how old you feel might affect your lifestyle choices. So when you're feeling young, you might be more likely to go out and, go for a walk or go meet with friends. Whereas when you're feeling older, you might be less likely to do those things. And so we believe that that's the route by which subjective age can affect health and wellness, that in a momentary way, it's affecting your lifestyle choices. Because these aren't all habitual, right? We make decisions based on our current context, both environmentally as well as internally. And so motivated by that contextual model that we put together, Matt and I are working on finishing up data collection for a grant that NIH awarded us to look at subjective age in daily life. And I have to say, for those of you who know about cognitive psychology, this is as far from basic experimental cognitive psychology almost as you can possibly get. This is way outside my methodological comfort zone, but it's also really fun. And so this work uses an experience sampling method where people go out into their everyday lives with a smartphone, either one we give them or their own smartphone that we've put apps on. And they answer questions that bubble up that are posed to them 6 times per day over a 7-day period. Beforehand, we had a big battery of questionnaires, surveys, cognitive ability tests. They do those at post-test too. This was a real bear to get going during a pandemic. I mean, on the one hand, they weren't coming in to do testing, but doing all of the training and all of the demographic battery online was tough. It did affect, I think, the selectivity of our sample. Had to be people who were comfortable with computers. So that's a downside, but we had to get it done. And it was 200 participants that we did these one-on-one testings with, and week-long following them with the experience sampling. And so we asked all sorts of questions to get at the immediate context. How mentally engaging was whatever you were just doing? How socially engaging was it? How physically engaging is, again, because as you go through life, you're doing different things. So say you're at the grocery store. So you would say, how mentally engaging is this? How socially engaging? How physically engaging? How challenging? How motivated were you? How confident were you? How much were you enjoying it? And is this task something that you think is more difficult for older people? Then we did the exact manipulation. So that's kind of uncontrolled contextual variability that we're just trying to study. But because I'm an experimentalist, we also did basically on the phones 6 times a day, the same experiment that Matt did with his participants in the laboratory. They, on their little phone, took either a memory test, a vocab test, or had no test. And so we're looking at that immediate context in an experiment, in a controlled experimental manner as well. And then we asked them about subjective age, both generally and in regard to, so some people who study subjective age think about it in a dimensionalized way. So thinking about mental abilities, social abilities, and physical abilities. Like I said,
Yeah, Celia posted a comment in the chat. Would you like to ask a question at this point, Celia? No? Okay.
Oh, the effects of COVID, that's such a great question. So we actually added a whole battery, well, actually like 4 batteries of COVID questions to try to get at, I mean, we couldn't, of course, look at it COVID or no COVID. It would have been lovely if we could have figured out how to experimentally manipulate that. But we did get their answers about their perceived risk, their behaviors, any social isolation and things like that, because I do think that it is going to have an impact on these patterns. I also think it's just cool to study because we're looking at these people's activities in daily life during a pandemic. So it seemed like we should take advantage of that opportunity. Yeah, great question. Yeah, we had tons of questions. Those are actually from established NIH batteries that they put together really speedily at the beginning of the pandemic. All right. So I don't have data to show you because we have about 6 participants left to collect, which is, I've got to say, like, if this will be one of the most satisfying studies to wrap up of my entire career, because it's been tough. And my lab manager had a baby partway through. So we've, which is wonderful, but also a challenge. So we've been figuring it all out. He did not turn out to be the lab tech that he could have been, but we'll trade him up, right? So, I mean, the baby, the lab manager is amazing. Okay, so I'm going to move on now to talking about a different line of research. This is the line of research that I've really done the most of, work looking at learning and how people shift how they approach learning as they get older. And really the take-home message of all of this is that older people often avoid using their memory when they're learning and instead use approaches that are more efficient. This has been really interesting to me because, again, it's one of these situations where it looks like decline and it's not necessarily. It's just a difference in choice and preference and approach. And so, again, almost all learning involves this type of shift in approach. Think about when you first learn to read. You know, you initially are like taking it out by the phonemes, and then you read the word automatically without even trying to. Memory based, learning simple math. Initially, you're counting on your fingers and doing all sorts of heroic things that are less efficient. Eventually, memory. Learning how to cook. The first couple of times you make something, you have to follow along in, well, probably not a recipe book anymore because it's 2022, but I still have like an entire case of these I will never get rid of. But eventually, like, you don't need to take the book down because you know how to make this thing if you make it often enough. So it's memory. Using shortcuts on a computer. Initially, you look them up, then you use memory. Learning to drive, really effortful. I have a 16-year-old son right now. Super effortful when they first start for everybody involved. Eventually, hopefully, it'll be memory-based and very fluid and automatic. Learning, I think a really good everyday example for many of us is navigation. Initially, you're either using GPS or a map back in the old days, and over time, you are able to transition to using your memory. So again, most learning is a transition from something that is inefficient and slow and complicated and often kind of error prone to using your memory. And the take-home message here is that older adults tend to be less likely to use their memory even when they have learned the information. looking at this for laboratory tasks. These are nonlinear regression fits to some data in my lab. And this is actually looking at percent retrieval use. So how often they're actually using their memory over time. More memory is, I guess, better. It's more efficient, at least. Young folks in black, older folks in red. You can see that across training, the young folks transition to using their memory very quickly and almost completely. The older folks use their memory a lot less often, like half the time. Now, you might say, and a lot of people did initially, well, it's just that they haven't learned. And this is what we used to presume in these tasks. But when we separately assess their learning of the information, that this is the same data, the same task, same people, for percent accuracy on memory tests, we find that the younger and older adults show some differences in their memory performance initially, but that is completely gone, non-significant after about a third of the way through training. A third of the way through training, there's still this massive difference, even at the end, massive difference in what they're choosing, how they're choosing to perform the task. But they don't have to. The older adults could use their memory. It's as good as younger people's in terms of their performance. And I've done dozens of studies on this, but the I mean, that's really sort of the take-home message. Some of the recent work I've been doing lately has been to look at individual differences again, and I've identified different subgroups of older individuals in terms of how often they use retrieval. Some of our older adults look pretty much like young. They transition maybe not quite as quickly, but very fully to using memory retrieval. Some are kind of moderate, and some of these folks never use memory. So it's not as simple. Again, so aggregation biases. You look at this, you should not think every older adult looks like this, and that every older adult uses, slowly transitions to using memory half the time. What we actually see is that some are never using memory and some are using memory a lot. And so it's really important to look at subgroups and individuals. Like I said, we've done a lot of work on this, and to answer basically why is this the case and what can we do about it? And in the lab, we've shown things like there are large individual differences. Like I said, that helped us identify those subgroups. Part of the reason for not using memory is memory confidence. So folks who don't use memory as often tend to not be as confident in their memories. They often don't recognize the speed benefit of retrieving, so it's a lot faster in all the tasks that we've used to use memory rather than to do the algorithm, whatever the first strategy was. And really for all of those examples I gave you, that was true too. It's almost always the case. It's going to be faster to use memory. Critically, they seem to, the older adults who don't transition to memory don't value being fast. So they might even realize that it's faster, but they just don't care. They want to be accurate. They most believe that the foolproof approach is to do whatever the algorithm is, like following the map or following the recipe. And so because that's what's important to them, rather than speed, they don't use their memory. But it's critically important that when we use kind of interventions to see if we can, encourage or force older adults to use memory, they do. They can shift just as accurately, just as quickly as young folks. We've used strategy, costs, and benefits. We've basically made it like really hard to use the algorithm, making it so it takes a while to kind of get it or get access to it, whereas memory is easier to get to. When we do this, older adults look just like younger folks. This is a really powerful one. If we just give them memory tests that show how much they've learned, so give them feedback on their memory, they will transition to using retrieval. So that memory confidence and lack of kind of memory monitoring seems to be important. When we, even in some studies, when we just tell them, hey, we'd like you to use your memory, they'll do it. So again, it seems to be very motivational. This is easy as an intervention. We'll talk, if we have time, I'll talk about some more intervention research that's not as easy. When we give them modest incentives, and in some studies where instructions don't work, if we just give them like, if they get a bonus, which basically means they get an extra like $3 or $4 at the end of the study. So this is not windfall financial reward, but it just shows we mean it. Then, you know, in all of our intervention studies, at least that has worked, even if instructions didn't. So again, it's very volitional. It's very much under their control. Tasks that don't involve retrieval, there are some learning tasks where you transition to things that aren't memory based, like selective focus. Like people will learn, like people who work at a bar, I hate this as an example, like work in a grocery store as a cashier or in a bar, they know where to look for your birthday to know whether you're of age to like buy alcohol, for example. And so that selective focus, it's not really memory based. They don't remember your birthday, but they just know where to look. So tasks like that involve a shift rather than scanning the whole darn card to looking in one place, they don't show memory avoidance, or they don't show a slowed shift. And we've done some work that hints at the idea that reducing stereotype threat, which I think is prevalent in laboratory testing environments, also encourages older adults to use retrieval more often. I mean, again, I could talk about this all day. I've been doing this work for a long time. A recent study we did just looked at more familiar materials, kind of like that Castell grocery price study. And when we use more familiar materials, older adults retrieve more often. So we've done some work in everyday life, daily diary studies where this is harder than subjective age because you can always ask people how old do you feel, but people aren't always learning or performing tasks that involve a strategy transition, right? A lot of the things we do aren't learned abilities. And so we did look at we isolated certain behaviors like cooking, shopping, driving, mail, that do involve like some aspect of learning, tasks that did or didn't involve retrieval, and asked them how they were performing them, how long they've been doing them, and a whole bunch of stuff. And we found similar patterns, but somewhat weaker, where relative to young folks, older folks were less likely to use retrieval, more likely to use slower, more efficient, complex strategies. And we're more likely to have low memory confidence for things they probably should be confident in, like cooking a recipe they've been making for 20 years or something like that. A simple recipe that they probably could use memory if you ask them. So I mentioned stereotype threat, and I want to talk about that a little bit more. So I assume everybody's familiar with the idea of stereotype threat. This isn't just about aging. It's the idea that when you are performing a task for which there's a stereotype about performance for a group that you're a part of, you are more likely to show deficits in performance than when you were not sort of primed with, or when you're not performing tasks with that kind of stereotype. And again, things that there's no actual deficit, there's just a stereotype deficit. There's been a lot of work in this looking at gender and at racial stereotypes and all sorts of things, but in particular, the work I've done, of course, has looked at stereotypes of aging. And so here's an example of some research. This is performance on a task called the reading span, which is a working memory task. So it's memory, but it's pretty complicated and hard. When you reduce older adult stereotype threat here, the young are in white, the older in black, and you see that there's no real performance deficit when you remove stereotype threat. When you tell people this is age fair, there's no deficit in it. If there were a deficit, that shouldn't work, but there isn't. And so removing the stereotype and making that clear to them. Sometimes work that just provides positive impressions of aging and isn't even related to the actual task will do the same thing. When people are in a stereotype threatened environment, then you will see these deficits where older individuals will do much worse than young. And there's a lot of work showing that the standard laboratory testing environment involves some element of threat. So not just this reduced threat and threat condition, but a sort of control condition that's just what we always do. And so I'm going to talk about stereotype threat from the perspective of research that I've done on attentional focus and mind wandering. So the idea that the context affects how you attentionally focus. And this is coming from a perspective that basically has in opposition, your cognitive control abilities and mind wandering. So for folks who have lower cognitive control abilities, mind wandering is more prevalent. And let me just say, people mind wander. The estimates vary, but between like 30 and 70% of the time, very contextually variable, as you can imagine, huge individual differences. And this has been a really rich area of study in cognitive science in recent years. And so the idea is that we all kind of have this stream of kind of worries and thoughts and things like that, that are happening in the back of our mind, below consciousness. And when you don't have good cognitive control in the moment, or just generally cognitively, those thoughts will be able to bubble up into consciousness, and you'll think about them rather than thinking about whatever task it is you're trying to do. And this is in the context of trying to do a mental task. Of course, it's not mind wandering to be like walking or doing so and thinking about other things, because you're not trying to do something cognitive. So the neat thing, I think it's both neat as well as interesting thing about mind wandering in older adults is that older adults mind wander a lot less than young. And that's surprising because cognitive control declines with age. And that's been pretty well established. It could have volitional aspects and engagement aspects to it, almost certainly does, but it's surprising given that that's what the state of the science has been. And so if mind wandering and cognitive control are in opposition and older adults have lower cognitive control, how do they mind wander less rather than more? Again, it's surprising given declines in attentional ability. And we study this by having people perform tasks and occasionally just ask them, what are you thinking about? We destigmatize mind wandering. We tell them people mind wander a lot. It's completely fine. Just tell us what you're thinking about. And in our work, we interrupt the task with thoughts about what you're thinking about, not why, because I don't believe people know why. So I do a lot of verbal report research, but I think it has limited utility. So basically they're doing something, they're doing a mental task, and we just, like a screen comes up and says, what were you just thinking about? If they say the task, they're on task. If they say task performance, then they're thinking about interference in the task. I say interference because it makes you perform worse. It degrades your performance on the task. So it's interfering, but you're thinking about the task, but you're just not doing it. And then what they call TUTs, or task unrelated thoughts, things like everyday things, current state of being, personal worries, daydreams, other. Young people are almost always thinking about being hungry or tired, I can say, as one general finding. Older people mind wander less, and everything 2 and below is mind wandering, but they mostly have TRI. They're mostly thinking about how they're performing the task. So it's closer to performance. In this study, this was a cool study because we looked at performance during an operations span task. So compared to a simple memory task where like you're given a bunch of words and then you have to remember them, an operations span task, you do a math problem and then you see a word. You do another math problem and then you see a word. You see another math problem and then you see a word. And then at the end, you have to say all those words. So it's a lot harder. It's a lot more complicated. You're trying to remember these words. This is a working memory span task. You're trying to remember these words while your brain's doing other stuff, while your mind's doing other stuff. I mean, your brain too, but your mind is doing other stuff. And so it's really hard. What I liked about this study, this was one of my previous students' dissertations, is that we could tell them, in order to evoke stereotype threat, we could tell them the task was about different things. We could say, this is a math test. Like vocabulary, older people are much better at doing mental math than young people, much better. They don't need calculators. They balance their checkbooks in their heads. I mean, there's like research showing all of these things in general. Younger people are really bad at that and they find it really stressful. So we can alleviate stereotype threat by saying, this is a math test. You're going to do great. Older folks do great. Or this is a memory test. So, and priming stereotype threat by saying, make sure that you do your best or something like that. And we've just asked them their age. So it primes stereotype threat without doing anything else. So it was a pretty subtle manipulation. And so again, older folks show more what we call task-related interference, thinking about how difficult the task is, performance, how they're going to approach the task. The basic finding from these, I mean, there's lots of other data, but what we found for TRI, and you don't really need to pay attention to the color of these bars, is that like always is the case, younger folks had less of this type of mind wandering than older folks, but we found that in the condition that we primed for stereotype threat, they did a lot more of this. So stereotype threat made them engage in more TRI, made them mind wander more. And that is their performance on the task suffered because of that. That's, I mean, I think the way a lot of stereotype threat is working, it's clogging your head with all these worries and thoughts about how you're doing the task and making you perform worse. So the context of stereotype threat affects your internal context of what you're thinking about and how you're performing a task. This is not volitional, but it's contextual. You're not choosing to think about these worries and not think about the task, but the context is driving you to do that. And we're seeing that, specifically here, but I think that's the case in a lot of the cognitive tasks that people are performing in the lab. These are just some models that some other folks did looking at how mind wandering is affected by motivation and interest. I think that might be the issue with older folks. The data so far is not, does not really support that, but this is just young adult data. So I want to really quickly wrap up by talking about all sorts of things that are really beneficial, that we know are beneficial to cognitive aging. Memory strategies, basically just knowing how to perform a task and knowing strategies, hugely helpful. Using effective strategies, the dark bars here, young and old, no age difference in basic memory when they use good strategies and are instructed in them. Ineffective strategies, older adults do much poorer. And this is just basically trying to remember, rote repetition or things like that. Mental exercise, you guys have probably heard this before, not a lot of evidence showing that games and apps, Lumosity and all that stuff helps cognitive ability at all. Some studies show narrow activity gains. If you play chess, you get better at chess. Very kind of chess specific cognitive abilities. Same for crossword puzzles and Sudoku, you get better at that thing. There's some big studies that have shown that. These is hundreds of studies in some research by Liz Stein-Morrow, where she had these engagement groups where they were like socially engaged and also performed tasks. And the training was in reasoning, and they got better at reasoning, but not on anything else, basically. This is an engagement group where they did divergent thinking training. They got better at divergent thinking, not better at anything else. And so you see these very narrow training gains. This is a really cool project by Denise Park at University of Texas, Dallas, where she had them do things like take classes in photography or quilting or do both, and looked at how that affects cognition. There are some gains, they're not very large relative to placebo. The photography class, they did better than placebo, not better than the social group though, which tells you that maybe a lot of the improvement is just being around other people and that kind of engagement and intellectual activity. So the bars and the asterisks are where they found significant effects, not a lot of significant effects, didn't do a lot. Heroic study, they did like 16-week classes. So they had folks, tons of people doing tons of work. And so some people might be like, well, then that's a waste. In the same way as some people would say, why do you do crossword puzzles? It doesn't help. But to me, like, did they enjoy it? This is looking at cognitive benefits. If people like doing crossword puzzles, it's not going to improve your intelligence, but if you like it, do it. I'm sure these people enjoyed doing the photography class. It just didn't make them smarter. And to me, that's okay, but it's good to know. Right? If you're doing something like that, if you hate the photography class, but you feel obligated because it will improve your cognitive abilities, like you're off the hook because you don't have to do it for that reason. This is some brain research, some brain findings from that same study. Basically, I pulled these out because it shows individual differences and how much it helped. It does help some people in terms of their brain, at least, not necessarily behaviorally. This shows behaviorally some differences. Some people show big benefits, some people don't show much. Again, individuals matter. You have to look at individual data. And so it doesn't mean it didn't help anybody. It just didn't help on average. And I'm going to close by mentioning what, again, I'm probably preaching the choir on this, what I believe is the biggest lifestyle intervention you can do for cognitive health. I know that folks in our kinesiology department would agree with me because they have spent a lot of time doing just ridiculously good research establishing this. This is some work from Art Kramer's lab when he was at Urbana-Champaign. Basically combining effect sizes from exercise versus, and these are light aerobic exercise groups versus control. And this does show broad transfer. So you see broad transfer. So it's not just that they get better at exercise, they do, but they get, their mind is sharper. They use, I mean, if we looked at brain data, they show massive improvements in the brain. I honestly think we should look at behavior, not the brain for that, because they often lag. And so what's often more important for people's functional health is what can they do? And exercise, like if, I mean, there's obviously really interesting work showing it can you know, slow the progression of Alzheimer's. And again, this isn't being an ultra marathoner, this is taking a walk. So I tell people, you know, if when people ask me what you can do, it's like, well, don't pay for Lumosity, go out and take a walk, it's free. Anyway, so contextual influences, I think that this is a really important one, training and interventions. My money is on exercising. But that is, I'm sorry, I went longer than I expected to, and probably talked faster than I should have. But thank you all for bearing with me, and let me know if you have any questions.
Thank you. That was fascinating. Let's see. I thought I had made you stop share screen. If you could do that, that would be.
Oh yeah,
great.
sure.
Okay, thank you.
Is it gone?
Okay,
Yeah.
it's nice to see everybody who's here. Several people had to leave and posted that in the chat. We do have about 8 minutes. I don't know, can you stay a little bit later, Dayna, if we run over?
Sure. Yeah.
Okay, so let me just start. I have a couple of comments and questions, but let me first ask if anybody who's here has a burning question or comment and needs to leave. So I'll start. Okay, Lori.
Hey, Dayna, this is Lori. Was just curious, was that an EMA study you were describing using the phone?
Yeah, it's EMS, EMA, yeah.
Okay, and
so you
part
can
of the reason
momentary assessment or experience sampling method. Yep.
And part of the reason I was asking, along with Jackie in kinesiology, we were sort of in the same boat of recruiting folks during the pandemic, but you have to admire 200 older adults who would exercise with masks. But it'd be interesting to even compare the recruitment. And what I was quickly going to say, a study that we did a couple of years ago just got published in Innovations in Aging in using EMA in older African Americans. But fascinating, and thanks for your presentation. And I too have to exit for another Zoom.
Thanks, Lori. Thank you for coming. Yeah, recruiting right now for a study of this scope, it was something. Sympathies to you, and I'd be glad to chat about what we used and how we fared.
Is there anybody else who wants to ask a question right now? Krista?
I put it in the chat, but it might have got buried. Back when you were talking about when older adults felt like they could do a better job on a memory or on a math test versus a memory test, were there any gender differences in that? Because I know, like with younger people, we do see where you know, girls often get socialized that they're not good at math, and as they get older, they have a harder time with it. Did you see anything like that?
That is a great question, because we also actually did a young adult only gender stereotype threat study with exactly that mindset, like looking at female students, whether or not they were primed with stereotype threats about gender differences in math. I mean, as is often the case, like our samples of older adults are so lopsided in favor of women that we don't, but we do ask them for, we did ask them to report their confidence in their math ability, and it was higher than the younger folks who were more balanced. So despite the fact that there were more women in our older adult sample, we didn't, our sample size wasn't large enough to do a kind of regression approach with any statistical power that I would be comfortable in with, but I don't, yeah, I don't know for sure, but I at least know that they thought they were better at math than the young folks did.
Thank you. And I have to run too, actually, I have another
Yeah.
meeting. But thank you so much. This was great.
Ed, I think you had a question in the chat. Would you like to bring that up?
Yeah, great. Thank you. Every morning I turn on the television and there's this ad about these pills you can take that make your memory better and make you function better. What is your comment and advice of what's going on with that?
I mean, I haven't seen anything that worked as well as exercise. I can tell you that. I mean, most of the things that I've seen are, I mean, it's often for things that are unregulated, so not FDA approved, which makes it really problematic. But even when they are, from what I've seen, and I definitely, this is not, you know, my area of focus. So there could be something that's hot and new that I haven't noticed, but I haven't seen anything that was impressive enough to me that I would tell somebody to do that rather than exercise. And, you know, the other thing with exercise is like when something's pharmaceutical, you usually have to worry about side effects. All the side effects of walking are pretty good.
Thank you. That's great. Let me register with you. After I hear those ads, I always go to the fitness center. That's
yeah. That is, I mean, that's what I do. I mean, you see among people who do cognitive aging researchers, like it's a pretty fit group of people because everybody believes in exercising. I mean, even if you're just, again, it's an easy amount. You don't have to run marathons. It doesn't have to be very high cardio work. It's just getting out and moving a little bit, and which is also very good for general well-being, good for mental health disorders. It also more beneficial by some studies than pharmaceuticals for depression or anxiety. So walking is better than SSRIs or whatever drug is out there as well.
Does pacing count? That was a joke. But, anybody else have a question right now? Okay, let me just one comment, and then I also had a question. The comment is, when you were talking about social networks being smaller and denser as we age, I am a friendship researcher. I haven't collected new data for a long time, but even back in the 70s, my data showed multiple changes to networks, multiple pathways to networks. And although they shrink and become more dense on the average, that is also shaped by contextual issues and life course. And it depends on where your networks were when you became old, whether they get smaller or larger. I showed, for example, women who had worked their whole lives and hadn't had an opportunity to develop many friendships, actually expanded both the size and the variety. So I just wanted to point that out, that there's individual variations in that. And and
I really appreciate you pointing that out, because I think individual variation is such an important thing to look at, and it's such an important way to think about things, because I mean, especially in older adulthood, there's just so much variation based on just sort of built up life experiences, like you were saying. I mean, you look at a group of 70-year-olds and they're as different as possible. We don't see as much. There's some variation, of course, in our college samples, but they're a lot less variable. Even in a place with like the rich diversity that we have at UNCG, there's still a lot less variable in terms of the types of phenomena that we're looking at.
Right. And then I just wanted to ask you what you thought about this kind of hypothesis I have that I don't think there's data to test, but when you were talking about as we age, we need to get more benefit back in order to want to invest the cost. of engagement. I was thinking that this could have something to do with COVID strategies. Going out, it may be that older adults are more likely to shelter because they consider that cost benefit ratio more than younger adults do. What do you think about that?
I think that's probably the case. I also think that there's another example of individual variation. I mean, I've heard so many anecdotes from people of folks who will say things like, they're in their, late 70s, early 80s, and they're like, older people are at high risk. It's a good thing I'm not old, So, so they will continue to engage, to be social and to do things. And so I think there's a ton of variation. I think you might be right. I mean, the work on selective engagement is so new. It's really only been, maybe a decade that people have been doing work from that orientation. And so I think there's a lot, and usually it's been in pretty simple mental tasks rather than looking at complex behaviors. And so that seems like, and actually I didn't talk about this work, but there are a couple chapters in the book about decision-making and how decision-making changes as people get older. And of course, with the kind of complexity of most everyday decision-making tasks, as well as kind of laboratory decision tasks, there's going to be a ton of variation and a ton of different variables that are playing into those. And I think the cost benefit probably is, I bet the data is out there. Actually, there has been a ton of research and study on COVID.
Right.
A lot
that's
of work
possible.
out there already. It'd be impossible to read it all almost, but and it's not in one place relative to looking at other areas of study when the people who do that work and what to search for and things like that. I know what they're going to be citing if they're doing selective engagement work. They're not doing that work and not citing Hess's psych science paper on it. But with COVID, everybody's doing it. So those data might exist. I bet they do. I just don't know them.
Well, maybe I'll search for it. The other thing, and I'm sorry, I've got this was so fascinating, but when I teach gerontology, I point out the U-bend in happiness, that younger people think they're going to get sadder and sadder as they age, but in fact, that happens and then a positive, happiness goes up. And it seems to me that I found your observation of the finding that older adults remembered positive things more, that could help explain that U-bend in a way that I hadn't thought of before. So I appreciated that. And the only other thing I wanted to say is that I'm going to be back in touch with you because I'm starting the request for collaboration thing, but I'm going to be developing a course called Disrupt Ageism, which I've taught before, but I hadn't thought about ageism and stereotypes affecting performance and kind of feeding back into the negative assessment of older adults. And so I will be in touch about that and maybe about updating your contributions to the introductory gerontology course, because it's been a while since we've done that. Does anybody else want to introduce themselves and offer collaborative opportunities? Does anyone want to introduce themselves? Okay, well, Dayna, this has just been amazing. And I have a feeling this might attract a lot of attention to our Growth YouTube channel. I want to point out that we also have a UNCG Gerontology Facebook group, which you're all welcome to join if you're not members. Chantel has an Instagram thing going for gerontology that you can follow. And Elise runs a LinkedIn page for us. So there are many ways for us to connect. Please share the invitation you received to this event with others and tell them to click on the opt-in sign up form buttons down at the bottom of the invitation so that we can grow our reach and experience growth. Dayna, do you have anything else you'd like to add?
I just really appreciate everybody coming. Especially, I was just thinking about Lori's comment about recruitment. So many of us do research with, our older community members. And so I think talking about, beyond just projects, really talking about strategies and how we do that, I think is always a really valuable thing. And it's not like a one-time thing because we're all changing our methods all the time. We're all like, we have new projects that sort of call for a different approach. And so, kind of making regular contact about those things is great. And, anybody, contact me anytime. I love getting emails that aren't administrative budget emails. So
I just one other question, because I am 69 years old and could volunteer for some of your research. Do you provide your participants with their individual assessments?
We don't, because we aren't licensed clinicians. And so,
Okay.
I don't do that. And I also, this is partly because when it's things that are not cognitive tests, in theory, we kind of could. But I have had too many spouses leave bickering with compared to the results that I'm like, I don't want any part of this, or friends that are no longer friends because they lorded over them how they did. So, and I honestly think that for a lot of these tasks, implicit performance feedback, so how people feel that they're doing, is often pretty good. I'll sometimes talk with people about it, but I don't send them their results.
Yeah, I was just thinking about that cost benefit ratio for engagement.
Yeah, some of our studies give feedback as you're doing it, but they're feedback to bring home with you for that reason. Now, I do tell people, now, if a person performs in a way that's concerning, at a very concerning level, we might find a way to kind of gently inquire about any help. Just like if a person just fails our vision test really badly, we will say to them, have you seen an eye doctor lately? I mean, this is just one test given by people who are not ophthalmologists, but you might want to, so we do always situate it in the intent of our work. We're not judging people's vision for the purposes of correction. And so we will kind of gently encourage people to get assistance.
Okay, well, thank you very much. Thank you to everyone who came. We will be sending out the YouTube link as soon as me gets around to it. And thank you very much, Dayna. This was just amazing.
Thank you guys so much. It was really lovely. Bye. Be in touch.